At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Now, firstly today, I'm aware that some of our listeners might find the content of this episode challenging to absorb, but I hope you can listen with an open mind and heart to what feels to me personally like a really important discussion for all of us. When I first set out to make this podcast, my intention was always to think global and 360 about who might have important insights to share with me and our listeners when it comes to trees, the environment, and how best we all might collaborate to face into deeply layered and existential issues that affect every person alive today. Colonialism and the Industrial Revolution laid the foundations for an extractivist mindset in Western society when it comes to natural resources and how generally we view nature and trees as inferior to GDP and commercial development, with many ancient and important cultures and landscapes displaced, leaving millions of people without homes, health, or a clear sense of identity day to day. My special guest today is Liba Ravindran, a London-based community organiser of Sri Lankan heritage, a climate justice activist, and a global majority poet with a deep affinity for trees and the natural world. We chat about his life growing up in Norway, green space in London, sustainable living, and the spiritual rootedness of trees. I hope you take inspiration from this honest and expansive conversation. Liba, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. It's really nice to meet you. We're here in this cafe in East Barnet, North London, and I'm feeling like I really want to learn more about your world actually and delve into what trees mean to you. So if it's okay with you, let's start with that topic. So Liba, what do trees mean to you?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on to this podcast, and very blessed to be here. Trees. My first, or one of the first kind of childhood memories that bring up a lot of joy for me is climbing trees. Being next to trees and climbing trees. I grew up in Norway. So I grew up in Scandinavia, and I was there for the first 9 years of my life. And the most kind of vivid impressions I have of my childhood is being around the trees, being with my friends, climbing them, scouting around the area. There was a time where we used to make dens. We used to make kind of nature dens as boys, as young kids, growing up into a little grove about 5 minutes away from where we used to live. And that felt especially powerful. That felt especially potent to be able to connect to trees in that way from a young age.
A lot of our listeners may have never been to Norway. I wonder if you might describe, what kind of trees do they have there that you were climbing in and playing around? Take us back to that time.
A lot of pine. A lot of pine. I mean, I think Norwegian trees are very famous for that kind of thing. I think it's Christmas time, Trafalgar Square, in fact, there's a tree that's donated from Norway, and it's planted in the middle of Trafalgar Square as a commemoration. So yeah, I think a lot of pine, a lot of different types of conifers, essentially, is what I remember. And the trees were beautiful. The trees are very much kind of sculpted in a way that no matter how cold, how warm, how whatever the weather was, they would just be standing there. They'll be solid. And there was a sense of kind of ever-presence, a sense of kind of deepening rootedness and a grounding and a relatedness, no matter what the seasons were, no matter what was taking place. You know, you could rely on the trees to still be there. So that kind of sense of almost like this eternal presence, you know?
We're not in Norway now, so what happened next? Where did you go next? And what did you take with you from that time then?
Yeah, I mean, I came to this big city called London in 2000. So I was 9 years old at the time. And I think I really lost that sense of being in a community, being in a space where there was kind of more wildlife, there were more trees, there was more biodiversity, there was more green growth, a slower pace of life. There was a neighborhood feel. People would be in relationship with each other in a more kind of egalitarian way, you could call it. And there was something there for me that I felt disconnected from when I came to London. Although there were trees, there were parks, there were national parks or areas of protected green spaces, it didn't feel like the fjords and the mountains and the birch and the oak and the fir trees, the spruce, all the stuff that I kind of encountered from a young age, all the birds and the wildlife. It felt very much detached from that in a sense of concrete, street lights, the concrete jungle, as they call it, hive, the busyness, the lack of time, the stress that builds up and accumulates. And ultimately the atomization, that was really stark for me, that even though there was all these people in all these places, it felt quite isolating in some sense. And that was a difficult thing to reckon with. It took me quite a few years to get round to understanding British culture and British sensibilities, but also, multicultural London. And obviously, on the face of it, very diverse, very accepting of different cultures, different types of being. But actually, from my point of view, also the first instances of discovering and encountering racism and systemic oppression in interpersonal ways, and other forms of marginalization, and yeah, it's a funny one, it's quixotical, you could say. Growing up in a small town in Norway, what do you think? Less multicultural, less diverse, but actually the instances from my parents and myself of any form of racism, discrimination were really low there. There seemed to be more accepting, more tolerant in that sense.
And can you give me some examples of what kind of things you experienced here then that, were jarring and felt like harder edges?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go into it too much, but I can speak to it on some level. And I think it's small things. I grew up fairly kind of low income, I would say low middle class or kind of working class kind of background. My family, they're in a news agent for a while up the road in Oakwood. So it's like a community kind of offering, I guess. They were having that for about 20 years, doing that, 15, 20 years. And I think there was a sense that free school meals, like the clothes I would wear, maybe not having an English accent, those kind of things were picked up on. And just kind of small remarks, comments, microaggressions, other ways of subtly othering, taking on kind of an Asian accent or commenting on foods, curries and foods. And obviously our food kind of smells. It's aromatic, it's fragrant. I think it's a beautiful thing to celebrate, but some people would pick up on it and dismiss that or reject that or make a mockery out of it. So I think there was a lot of those kind of experiences, small potentially, but over time building up, and a whole confluence of them made this kind of sense of I'm not accepted here, or my being is not accepted in the same way.
And I guess at the moment, these things are in some ways finally a bit more in focus, and actually we have some language to be able to address or acknowledge those things. Before we go a bit further into that, I wonder if you might just tell me about the significance of trees perhaps in your family's culture or maybe spiritually. What kind of role might they have played there or continue to play there?
Absolutely. Now, trees, in my mind's eye, it's like a beacon of light. It's a spiritual beacon of light. And I feel that when I went to Nepal, it was very obvious, but I think it's same. I'm Sri Lankan Tamil. It's my heritage. All of my ancestors come from one place in the world, a place called E11 in Jaffna, northernmost city in Sri Lanka. And I'm the product of civil war and, colonization. There's 3 countries across 500 years. One of the things for me in terms of the spiritual rootedness within trees is that in South Asian cultures, you often find in India, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, any sort of kind of shrine or prayer area or almost like a mandala or a place where people go to worship is often next to a big tree. So a tree that's been existing for hundreds of years, big girth, massive tree, you can tell it's been around for a while. Those trees are often the places where people put temples next to, or places of worship, or they have like a shrine with a photo, a kind of decorative thing they would do, maybe some flowers they would ornate, or incense or candles or some sort of offering. And there's some deep connection between trees and also spiritual enlightenment. If you think of Buddha, the Buddha found enlightenment under a Bodhi tree. And there was a Bodhi tree. The Bodhi tree is like the symbolism of light, of growth, of becoming, of being, of becoming. And I feel that that's a deep thread running in South Asian culture, heritages, spiritualities, this kind of connection to nature, the interconnectedness of everything.
We've already kind of, through what you've said there, touched on so many different themes. And what it's making me remember is that, climate change and net biodiversity loss are absolutely a global issue, right? And also so deeply entwined with social and economic issues as well. And that's been the case for a long time now, And I know this is subject matter that you've been bringing particular focus to. And I'm really early in my journey of understanding those issues, or trying to at least understand or listen and learn about them. But there's some key terms that I have come across in the last year or so, and I think it could be useful to perhaps share those as some reference points to help with some of the other conversations we might have as part of this chat. So one of the ones that really has kind of stuck with me is this concept of intersectional environmentalism. So what is that about then?
So I'm aware that this kind of term intersectionality has come into being through Kimberly Crenshaw, who was or is a kind of critical race theorist, someone who studied a lot around racial justice, race equity in America, was a professor, and kind of came up with this term as a Black woman who faced multiple forms of intersecting oppression. So what I say intersectionality is the kind of net of the multiple intersecting nodes of oppression. For example, race and class, or gender and sexuality, or disability and neurodiversity, for example. So it's often that if we look through a singular lens of a singular type of oppression, we don't understand the whole of the person. If we understand them through many different lenses, many different intersecting lenses, we build up a more of a holistic picture, you could say, of the oppression that they face.
Yeah, and so it's about growing empathy for those sometimes layered disadvantages relative to perhaps people without those struggles to manage and deal with in their lives.
Absolutely. And, just connecting that to the environmental element is that, traditionally the environmental sector has been very white. It's been very middle class. It's been populated by men mostly. And it's been kind of taken up in terms of the space by people who have what I call hegemonic power. The dominant culture norms, the ones who have the most power, the most privilege in our society, historically speaking, in the West here. And there's a whole confluence and miasma of reasons why that might be. One of the main ones for me is the green and the environmental sector as a whole has been very much thought of as almost like what I call the kind of green and pristine land, the Jerusalem, the kind of idea, this beatific Albion vision of this kind of beautiful place to go and retreat into, the countryside, right? Which is often, people who are more conservative thinking values. There's a real reverence for the countryside, for the great outdoors, for the wild, for those kind of maybe not so much the wild actually, but definitely the outdoors and the green spaces and the preservation.
An idea of the wild, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that plays into tradition and traditionalism in the sense of conserving and preserving heritage. And I think there's something there about how that appeals to certain sensibilities that are not from different identities, different types of lived experiences, especially those who are ethnic minorities or people of color, because we've grown up with nature inside and around us in all of our cultures, languages, expressions, spiritualities, and otherwise for hundreds of years, often unbroken for some parts of the world in the global south. Whereas here, from my observation and expression, is almost like nature is outside of us. It's this thing that we go to. I'm going to go into the nature today. But in fact, we are human beings. We are nature ourselves, right? We are part of nature, not outside of it.
Yeah, it's kind of viewed as a commodity. I've definitely been guilty of that myself, kind of, seeking out places and almost like waiting till you get there to feel that benefit or let yourself feel that benefit. Really interesting. The other term that has really stuck with me, Liba, recently is the one of global majority. And that really did just kind of get me to stop and think. And I wonder if you might go into that one for me.
Yes, well, there's many of us, simply put. And, if you look at the populations, I think in India at the moment is 1.4 billion. I believe in China is something like 1.2. So, the majority of the population, if you look at it as a whole, is made up in the world. Yeah, absolutely. It's made up of black and brown people, melanated people from non-white non-European lineages. So yeah, absolutely. In the UK, you could put an argument towards certain super cities, what they call ethnic super cities, super diverse cities. So Leicester, Birmingham, London, where pretty much over 50% of the population is now global majority, racialized people. So many different terms to speak of here. But global majority for me, I'm definitely slowly gravitating towards more, because it feels almost like a reclamation of the sense of we're always called ethnic minorities, or we're called kind of groups that always have a lesser standing or less privilege or underrepresented, underprivileged, marginalized, all these kind of terms which kind of make us feel small, essentially. So global majority, in a way, is almost this reclaiming that actually we are the dominant group. We are the dominant kind of types of people in the world as a makeup in the world. And I think that's something to be celebrated.
Yeah, and if you look in human history, that's pretty much always been the case as well, which is, kind of an irony, I guess. Just chatting to you, I've got one thing I'd like to just put to you. So before we press record, we had a chat about, some of your experiences of finding your own identity, etc. And actually, you mentioned that a trip to Sri Lanka really helped with that and perhaps set foundation for some of the work that you've been doing recently. And then I'm thinking that's an island, right? And the UK is also an island as well. And just chatting to you, about that sort of Albion vision and, the sort of, there's a fierceness to protecting certain ideals. And I do wonder sometimes if that might come a bit of being a small island. And also in the last sort of 80 years since the World Wars, one that actually is kind of, in a sense, defending itself from the greater continent of Europe in this case. But I don't know. I'm wondering if that might have played into why some people are certainly attached to certain ideas and hanging on to those. But also when you visited Sri Lanka, were there parallels? What was it about that experience that really kind of gave you that strength?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think there is definitely parallels, island nations, absolutely. I see a lot of similarities actually between Jamaica and Sri Lanka for lots of different reasons as well. Being an island nation full of tropical fruits, beautiful people, friendly faces, deep spiritualities, and also obviously a product of colonialism, war, and some way slavery or indentured slavery. So I think there's a lot of commonalities there. But I think there's something you're speaking to, which is a truism. I think there's a protectionist mindset. There's a sense of kind of defending the coast or defending the coastline and preserving the heritage and the culture within. And, in my culture, Sri Lankan Tamil people especially, we've faced a lot of different types of oppression from colonization, but also from our own government, from our own peoples. And part of why, for example, in my cultures and my families, they're very much about almost that village-like mentality of preserving their customs, their cultures, their songs, the food they eat, the recipes, the saris, the dresses. There's so many different kind of minutiae of different types of cultural sensibilities and practices and spiritual kind of lineages that we draw from that. And I'm part of this story of the generations who've fled because of war or persecution, become refugees, asylum seekers, and so forth. How we've lost a lot of that. We've lost a lot of the kind of customs, the cultures, the practices, some of the language, some of the religious and spiritual meanings behind what we do. One of the things for me was really stark when I went in 2014. So I was 22 years old at the time. I was there for 3 months. And 2 of those months I was in my hometown where my mum and dad grew up in E11 in Jaffna. And I went into Jaffna one day, I went into the city and, I wrote this piece around social realism of Jaffna. I was remarking on the kind of tattered saris, the dust-swept roads, the beaming heats that was like sweltering, and there was something quite beautiful about that, what people would call a lesser economically developed area in the West, what I would call a spiritually significant place. And I felt the same when I was in Nepal and Kathmandu. I really felt that energy. And I went into the city, I noticed this shopping complex, and I noticed there was a KFC, and it really tore at my heart. Traditionally in our town, in our place, it's not really been that much kind of Western American influence. And this is kind of the first sign really of capitalism, Western capitalism on steroids, ultimately coming in, butting its way in, setting up its shop and selling its products. And, we often have markets, independent traders, lots of people out on the streets. All the money goes back to those people because they often produce it. It's often kind of agrarian, agricultural-based societies. So to see the mass manufacturing, the production, the Western kind of like ideals being put into place in my hometown, it felt almost sacrilegious. It felt wrong. It felt like another form of colonization, which it is. For me, it's the kind of neo-colonial form, what we call globalization or what we called economic development. There's all these kind of terms which sound innocuous, but if you look into them and you start realizing actually this is extractive, this is transactional, this is actually benefiting businesses and certain individuals who own these corporations. And it means that a lot of the people who are on the ground, who are living there, who are living those more pastoral, agricultural, agrarian lifestyles are often out of a job, out of means of production, out of means to be able to live and feed their families and preserve their cultures and their heritages. So it's on multiple fronts, a big shift.
What's quite interesting also, though, is that those people that perhaps have less income maybe have some of the more sustainable lifestyles and solutions to
Absolutely.
living a life that's more in balance with natural resources. Coming back to London then, do you see that in minority populations, and are there cultures in London that actually everyone could learn something from in trying to access greater sustainability?
Absolutely. And I can give quick shout outs to a few little groups and spaces that I've been part of, or that I think is worthwhile for your listeners to check in. So Go Grow with Love, amazing project started by a woman called Sandra in North London, not too far from here. And she's a Black African Caribbean woman, heritage-wise. And yeah, beautiful broad woman, just for melanated women, growing soil, connection, planting, and growing culturally sensitive food. So it was done on a kind of left behind allotment that wasn't being used, and they kind of reclaimed the space and regenerated it. And now it has this big community offering and benefit to people who are often marginalized, not accepted, not fitting into the society. There's also another group called Black Roots. They're in North London too. I used to be part of them. They're the first Black-led horticultural group in London, or in the UK even. And that project is amazing in the sense that it's Afro-Caribbean led. It's the first one of its kind when it comes to a gardening project or horticultural project that is relatively culturally connecting to our heritage, to our diaspora, but also in a sense actually practicing the values of how to grow, how to cast the seeds in a certain way. Because one of the things, I remember one of the stories I got, when people are planting seeds here in the UK, it's a very mechanical process almost. There's this kind of, seed, take it out of the bag, put it in, water it, cover it, that kind of thing. Whereas in some of our cultures in the global south, there's this kind of thing of seeds are alive, seeds are the kind of start of all life. And you sing songs, you sing these beautiful songs of joy, of love, of connection, of harvest, of bounty and abundance, whatever it might be. And you sing for the rain, you pray for the rain. It's a very spiritual act, is what I'm saying. There's a bigger context, a wider context as to how and why they are planting those seeds. Because seeds obviously are the start of all life and provides us food and a nourishment and a sustenance for us to keep going, to be alive. And I think that just that kind of metaphor in itself kind of shows you probably that here there's more of a kind of wave of, in a way, almost resistance, reclamation, rematriation, which is another interesting word. Rematriation is when there's a history of kind of soil, and we often call soil fertile soil, right? So there's a kind of fertility to the soil. So rematriation is almost this kind of sense of the Mother Earth returning into the earth. And in fact, this might be a perfect segue for me to read my poem called Mother Earth.
Sounds ideal.
Okay, so one of the great gifts and beauties of this life for myself is poetry and reading poetry, writing poetry. I've been doing it since 21 years old and been able to be blessed to write something quite special with this poem, I believe. So this one's called Mother Earth, and I wrote it when I was in a spiritual event last month. Regenerative farming in harmony with nature. Om Shanti to ancestral practices, planting native species. To be in keeping with the local context is vital, as much as global living is interconnected in all. Permacrisis in a world full of war on interbeing. Uproot sacrifices that we make for a short-term pleasure. Reconnecting with Mother Earth takes shape inside, acting reciprocally to fulfill our duties to share. Giving back our love to mycelium threads on the ground. Simplicity through transformative action is justice, grounding itself in dharmic resonances, like a lotus.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Can I ask you about trees in London? Do you visit trees? Are they just part of your environment? I'm aware that actually some areas of London have more trees than others, and often that correlates with the more affluent areas. And we can sometimes think that the US is where this kind of lack of equity is happening, but actually it's evident in our cities also, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, actually, London, as a percentage of all of the land in London, 50% is green space, which is a staggering amount. But a vast majority of those green spaces are on very affluent, often middle class, often white-led dominated spaces. So they're kind of inner city areas, the areas where maybe there's a bit more deprivation, there's more injustice, more poverty, more inequality, more crime, more pollution, bad air quality, a whole raft of environmental issues. There's a big incinerator actually being built in Edmonton, which is one of the largest black dominated areas in London. And I think there's a deep correlation between the two as to why, politically speaking, they're able to put through such a heinous project that is going to cause a lot of ecological destruction and environmental destruction in a place which is very much populated by Black and brown people. A classic case of environmental racism. So yeah, I think a lot of green spaces are out of touch, out of sight, almost out of mind for a lot of people of color who are living in the city. And that's a grave shame, because it's proven time and time again that in terms of our mental health, in terms of our well-being, in terms of our connection to the soil, to the earth, to the nature, we need that presence. We need that around us. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've realized and has been kind of validated is often kind of, I often find that in my body, somatically, experientially, I kind of have some realizations, have some deep connections, deep truths. And then I'd read it somewhere in a journal or a paper or an article or something. It's like, oh, yes, this is validated. So I found this thing where if you put your hands on the tree, the impressions of your hand onto the bark of a tree, the tree actually can feel the sensitivity of the hand. So there's an imprint that is left from the hand. And obviously we have electromagnetic waves and kind of nervous system going through our bodies. And the signals actually can be felt. Those signals in our hands that we're sending out as pulses, especially if we're praying or sending out a mantra or something like this, it can be felt by the tree, up down to the roots or through the branch or through the trunk. So I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, we're also surrounded by a microbiome as well, and we each have a kind of microbiome identity, if you like, of millions, billions of microorganisms that help protect us and also interact with anything living. And that is shaped and evolves as we connect with nature day to day. So actually by touching a tree, you're kind of swapping over some of that. And that's quite a nice comforting thought, actually, isn't it? That, yeah, we're kind of in a team with trees at times. And definitely when you think about that well-being factor as well, they're really important. And they help to soften the edges in the city as well, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think why a lot of people of color have, I think it's very systemic, council estates, impoverished areas with really lack of green space, lack of parks and clean green spaces, good air quality. It really does cut us off from the possibilities of our own liberation, cuts us off from the potential of our own enlightenment ultimately. And for me, the kind of spiritual and the political are very much interconnected, as pretty much anything is. And trying to see it in those lenses helps to build up a bigger picture that actually the political conditions of us having to essentially what I call fight for scraps, essentially the dregs of capitalism, of this kind of almost post-colonial system, post-capitalism that we're going into, which is essentially the collapse, the kind of start of the collapse of the world inside and around us. I think that in itself has been prefigured by the very structured and systemic cutting off of us from the natural environment. So you have what I call walls, ceilings, doors, locks, keys. You have every form of segregation, essentially, almost like building our own private prisons. And we have social media, we have phones, we have screens, we have technology, we have everything, right? Supposedly. But none of it is actually the thing itself. It's all stuff that is kind of almost symbolic and representative of the thing itself, of the kind of source of where everything has come from, which is the soil, the earth, the sky, the universe around us, inside of us. But I think this is what I'm noticing more and more in my experience.
Yeah. And how many people stop to think that actually underneath the concrete as they're walking down the pavement is actually soil, right? Not even that far away from their feet.
Yeah.
But at the same time, a million miles away. What do you think then is the biggest misconception or ideological barrier that is preventing us at the moment from making progress?
That's a big question. And I guess I have to kind of qualify what that means in terms of the making progress. But if I have a stab at it initially, then maybe you can clarify after as to what types of progress there are, because it's a dense issue. I think for me, it's about the fact that we have all the solutions. We need to implement them. We need to be able to do these solutions now. For too long, we've been waiting for governments, for corporations, for these big, large entities with lots of power to do something. The UN, the IPCC, National Trust. We have all these big institutions that have a lot of power, and we're waiting for them to do something big. But often it's the case that they're so enmeshed and almost like hegemonically trapped in the system. There's a lot of interest that they're having to serve, which means they're taken away from doing what I call the prefigurative work, the transformative work, which really requires a lot of dreaming. It requires a lot of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. It requires kind of sense of deeply tuning in to what's happening on the ground. Keep your ear to the ground and your eyes up there to the stars. And I think there's that kind of sense that we're not able to channel that energy. We're very much stuck in our silos, in our bubbles, in our complexes, in our private prisons, as I call it earlier, in our kind of complicity, in our subservience to the systems, to the economic system, especially. So I think that's the first thing. It requires a real deep change in how we think, our consciousness, and also just acting more integrally in line with our conscience, in line with our ethics. But yeah, if I had to ask you around in terms of progress, as to what type of progress you might want to look into, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I was curious to just know how you might answer that. But I suppose when I asked it, what I was thinking was about empathy, actually, more generally. So I think there's a journey underway about wider empathy for perhaps some truths that weren't acknowledged previously. And that still feels really raw, actually. And that probably feels raw for people that have never even let themselves go there.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I observe, perhaps partially in myself, but certainly those around me sometimes, is that there can be a kind of a sense of personal guilt around that. But I don't think that's necessarily productive. I think there's a sense of responsibility, but that's different to guilt. And I think some people are hung up on the guilt and trying to sort of bat off what they might feel are accusations, but the truth is different to any kind of emotional response, right? And I think it's about trying to see the truth of the situation and that then allowing empathy to come in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think empathy and compassion are really important points when it comes to this. I think one of the main kind of artifices that I call, one of the main forms of conditioning, programming that has led to our current situation, from my point of view, is the lack of embodiment, the lack of feeling, and the lack of awareness in our bodies. It's almost like we've been cut off. Our head and our bodies are cut off from each other. There's a disembodiedness. And I feel that's almost like the crux of a lot of this thing of what has led to us thinking it's okay to take oil and gas from the ground and turn it into energy and use it. We're knowing that very fact has ramped up the temperatures for now, I don't know how long, 30, 40, 50 years it's been. Yet they're still building new oil and gas coal mines, oil and gas mines, coal mines as well in Germany, but rigs outside in the North Sea, in Scotland, and various other places. In Saudi Arabia, I think in the last COP that they had in Dubai. I think, there's real caution about phasing out even fossil fuels, the kind of end of fossil fuels. There's such a lobby and a protected interest of capitalism, of those who have money and power. So as much as I think we have to be resilient, I think there's things like empathy cafes, which are interesting. There's a lot of self-doubt, like there's a lot of eco-anxiety, there's a lot of kind of fear of death, of collapse, which is all very natural considering everything that we love and know and have come to appreciate. We may not be here in a few decades, if that. We're at 1.5 at the moment. I think that's been announced very recently. And, at its current rate, 2 degrees is definitely in view. And we're pretty much sliding towards 4 or 5 degrees by 2050, maybe, which essentially means everything that we know with all the tipping points will be gone. And it's just a really scary fact. It's a scary thing to reckon with. And how do I keep grounded? How do I, within all of those truths, know what I'm doing has an impact? I was mentioning to you, Tom, earlier before we started this, was I'm running a workshop tomorrow on grassroots community action. There was a citizen assembly that Barnet Council did last year. We're in Barnet at the moment, London Borough of Barnet in North London, the second largest borough in London. And I do a lot of community work as part of Inclusion Barnet. And there's this kind of sense that if we are not able to connect with people on the ground who are seeding the solutions, from community gardens to propagating trees, to community energy power, to reusing some stuff collectively, to recycling our waste, to having compost, to cycling lanes and, getting rid of all the single-use plastic, whatever it might be, cleaning up our rivers and our streets. If we don't do that collectively on the ground here, we have no hope for the world as a whole. So I always think it starts local and it can end up global. I think it's a rippling out, and I think it starts at home, literally in yourself, in your room, and then your family, your friends, your loved ones, your local street, your neighborhood, your ward, and hopefully the borough, and work wider than that. And I really believe in that action. I think there's something about acting in line, acting in principle, and that rippling out over time.
And what gives you hope these days? So where are those examples that, really kind of give you that belief that there is a chance we could turn this thing around?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I'm so fortunate to be involved in collective anti-oppression circle. That gives me a lot of deep hope inside. We're an intersectional justice network led by people of color, racialized people. And for me, why it's so crucial and important is the ability for us to practice collective care, the ability for us to come together and speak to liberation, for us to show up and support each other mutually, for us to stand up and be counted, to do the work of liberation, for us to be able to come to a place where we are heard, we are seen, we are listened, we are accepted for who we are. And these are deep human truths cut across all politics, all strata of different political ideology, comes to the crux of what it means to be human. And I think once we realize that in a space where we feel safe and comfortable, life becomes a lot easier. Life becomes more hopeful. Life becomes more dreamy. Life becomes, the possibility rather than a world of kind of, I guess, nightmares, or a world of kind of impossibilities, a world where we are kind of stuck and in chains and frozen from doing anything. So I think this is the kind of shifts that we can kind of start prefiguring and moving towards.
Maybe this might be a nice time to share your poem, BIPOC Trees.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you want to give a little bit of background to this one?
Yes, I can do. And BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. It's a term. We went on a retreat in Spain. Beautiful, beautiful area there. Just trying to remember some trees. Hornbeam, definitely. Willow. Beech. Definitely beautiful, beautiful trees. And it was on this peninsula. It was kind of near the Pyrenees almost. It was in the north of Barcelona, a place near Isona, which is a small town village in Spain. And it was a retreat, a week-long gathering of people of color, what we call BIPOC, activists, anti-oppression practitioners, facilitators across Europe. There's about 12 of us in total with 2 facilitators. And I came up with this poem called BIPOC Trees because trees for me are a symbol of resistance. Trees are a symbol of rootedness, what I call a kind of like a centeredness. There's a sense of grounding, of rootedness, no matter wind, rain, shine, storm, tornado, whatever it might be. The tree stands still. The tree is strong and rooted. And this is kind of almost like a spiritual philosophy of that emanating, but also the work we need to do in terms of anti-oppression and resistance. BIPOC trees. Strategies for healing a truly traumatized community, subject to harm and oppression our whole lives, seeking solace on top of a distant mountain, to regenerate our spirits and release certain feelings, connect beyond divides, pause for a gulp of gratitude. Start tragic happenings by pitching in recollections of how we be, what happened to us over wintry days. Stepping into resistance, we water our souls with inspiration. Learning to take care of each other as mutual beings, breaking free from societal norms that govern our lives. To explore visions of utopia that feel whole inside. Lavender bees suckle flowers that present themselves. In Spanish spring, naming our fears, to be clear.
Thanks, Liba.
Thank you, Tom.
We're heading towards the end of our interview, and before we part ways, I'd like to know, what would you envisage as an ideal future in terms of trees, the environment, people? What do you think of?
Well, in my belief, the solution's already there. All we need is the political will and the implementation of it. And nature in and of itself is restorative, regenerative, healing, self-healing, collective, moving as part of a community, looking after each other, having each other's backs, a transmission of transformative potential underground, the mycelium threads running. And as I said, that rootedness, the groundedness, knowing the contact with the soil that keeps us whole, that keeps us integrated, keeps us living our lives with integrity. And I think if we take inspiration from nature, nature's philosophy, and we apply it into our human realms, into our human societies, into our communities, as many indigenous communities have, many tribes, townsfolk, rural communities, here in the West too. People here who are practicing paganism and other forms of ritual and worship, of being with nature, druids. In the global south, in my home, in Sri Lanka, in E11, living low-impact lifestyle, meaning growing our own food, having not many roads for cars, having spaces for green spaces, not using plastic or single-use plastic, reusing our stuff, minimizing our consumption, because consumption is a big thing in capitalism. Not being driven by materialistic pursuits, coming back into our spiritual realm of our beings, communing with each other as part of a kind of wider ecosystem and a wider web, not forgetting that we are part of something bigger than us.
Thank you so much for all that you've shared in this chat. You've given me loads to reflect on, and anyone who listens to this, I know, will have plenty to think about and, more questions to go and explore in their lives. I'm going to hand to you to leave our listeners with a final message.
Well, first of all, just thank you very much for inviting me onto this beautiful podcast. I can see what you're trying to do here, Tom, and just witnessing that is a beautiful unfolding in itself. So please keep doing this work. We need more people to amplify trees. Trees may not be able to communicate with words, with English, with this language that we've become accustomed to, but they can communicate in many other forms and many other ways. And we can channel some of that energy and be able to transmit it in this way. So much the better. So much the better for doing the work that we need to. And secondly, in terms of a kind of message for listeners, I would really encourage everyone to start doing, start feeling, start being. I think these are the three things that are coming up for me. I often find there's a lot of discourse, there's a lot of talks and podcasts even, and material and things to consume and watch and listen to, but I feel there's more of a need to go out there into your local streets, go out and make that difference. I really encourage everyone, if you've listened to this, to make one meaningful act of difference in your local community in the next week of you listening to this, to go out and help a neighbor, to give something to a homeless person, to volunteer at your local community garden, to find the local food bank to serve some food, whatever it might be, because help is always needed, especially in these times. And then lastly, yes, the poem. So the poem is called Changing the World, starting off with the first kind of recording that I've done in a professional studio. Changing the World, it was done in a place called Planet Local. There was a big international summit, lots of international speakers, people like Charles Eisenstein, Bayo Kumalafe, Helena Norbert Hodge, Ian McGilchrist were there. And it was really inspiring. It got me into a kind of heady space of what is possible. What if all of us come together for something more meaningful? What if all of us can come together to change the course and the fate of our current planet? Changing the world, changing the world, changing the world, changing the world. The more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Manifest energy to heal the wounds of oppression. Planting rose bushes and smelling the flowers can be a retreat from the world intent on destruction. Progressive apple pie swallowing up eagles whole, signposting virtue when signaling a good person. When pretense is conceptualized to stand our ground, change is dangerous if it's too radical. White faces line the benches of progress, getting accredited to train ourselves in wisdom. Learning from textbooks that reproduce knowledge, capturing intelligence as if it only lives in our heads. Shamanic priests expel evil spirits from the body. The doctors who heal also pass on trauma. Without the whole understanding of contextual frames, we replicate power over games to imagine system change, forgetting to embody liberation in our interpersonal connections, generate morphic fields of resonance externally, sending vibrations out by not joining the forces to be. Complicity is key in keeping us guarded from collectivism, losing hope every day as the plastic piles up. Building relationships compassionately is our way out.